asked the DJ to dedicate a song to my ex at our wedding reception. He walked out mid-dance. Believe me when I say that I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Just 1 month ago, I was the happiest woman in the world. It genuinely felt like I was in the best place I'd ever been. And now it's all come crashing down and I don't even know where to start or how to fix things. Some of you will judge me for this, but I don't mind. Better to let strangers on the internet judge and insult me than the people I share blood with and have known for years, right? Anyway, I should probably start this post, it's more like a cry for help if I'm honest, by introducing myself and telling you a bit about the relationship I may or may not have just ruined. My name is Lola, female 29, and I met Tony, male 31, almost 6 years ago. It was a few months after I'd graduated college and was still considering whether I should stay in the city or move back home for a bit while I looked for work. One random night I was feeling especially bad about myself, and like anyone in their early 20s, I decided that the only way for me to feel better about myself was to get incredibly drunk. So I made my way down to a bar that was near my former campus and tried to do exactly that. I was in the middle of getting drunk when someone pulled up the chair beside me. I was irritated because I thought that they could have sat literally anywhere else but beside me, but I didn't say anything. Then the man started talking to me, and even though I was blatantly trying to ignore him, he kept on. It almost made me feel bad for him, but I was too busy feeling bad for myself to do anything about it. Eventually, though, I spoke to him. Maybe I was tired of drinking alone in a bar like I was twice my age, or maybe it was that when I finally turned to face him, he offered me the kindest smile I'd ever seen. I'm not sure, but that was how we started talking. He told me that he was having a bad day because of a crime scene. He's a police officer. I didn't tell him why I was there, and he didn't ask, which I was grateful for. We talked so much that we both forgot about our original plan to get wasted. I left the bar that night with his phone number. He'd given me his instead of taking mine so that I wouldn't feel pressured or weirded out. But I never called. The next time I saw him was at a coffee shop, and once again we sat together and talked for a bit. Luckily, he didn't ask why I didn't call. This time when we said our goodbyes, he took my number, but he didn't have to use it because I finally fished the number out of my purse and called him a day after we saw each other. That was how we started dating. I really didn't think it would go anywhere in the first few weeks that we were together. Sure, I liked him, and it was blatantly obvious that he liked me back, but I was still dealing with a lot of things and struggling to get back on my feet. The last thing I needed was a relationship, or at least that's what I thought. I didn't plan to fall in love with Tony. I didn't even want to. But after months of dating, I started to develop serious feelings for him, so much so that the thought of breaking up with him felt unfathomable. I couldn't bring myself to do it, and the more I spent time with him, the deeper I fell. We were together for over 5 years, and in that time, we grew so much closer. We moved in together. We had all the important conversations, kids, marriage, and all the rest. Despite everything that had happened before, I could genuinely see myself spending the rest of my life with him. It had been years, and even though there were still issues from my past kicking around, I loved Tony more than anything, and I was more than willing to look past and ignore the complicated feelings I still had if it meant that I could continue being with him. About 3 months ago, Tony finally got down on one knee and proposed. I obviously said yes. I couldn't imagine saying anything else. We left the wedding preparations up to my parents since they were too excited anyway, and Tony and I were pretty busy with work at the time. Everything was going great. Perfect, even. I went home to the apartment I shared with the man I loved every night, and each glance at my fingers reminded me that I would soon be married to him. It just seemed like my life couldn't get any better. So naturally, the universe had to do something about that. About a month before our wedding and reception, I got a call from an unknown number while I was making dinner. Curious, I answered it, and the voice on the other end was one that I hadn't heard in years. One that left me broken and in the worst place of my life. It was my ex-boyfriend Zach, the one who'd left me years back, and the reason I'd been at that bar drinking in the first place. In order for you guys to understand why Zach is so important to this post, and important to me, I need to tell you a bit about our relationship, the history of it, and how it led to that night. I met Zach when we were both really young, about 15 at most, because our moms quickly became friends when my family moved to a new town. It was scary and intimidating, being the new kid in a new town and a new school, but Zach was there to help me feel better and take me on a tour of everywhere. We just kind of clicked after that. I started to develop feelings for Zach about a year into our friendship. I didn't want to, because I liked our friendship the way it was, and I knew that romance would just end up ruining things, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. I spent almost every day with him, and almost every single hour of those days with him. I didn't think he felt the same way, though, so I kept it to myself until we were 17. We started dating in our last year of high school after I confessed my feelings, and we tried to make it work. After graduation, we both took gap years so we could continue being together. He was my first love, and I was absolutely smitten. Eventually, though, the time came for us to say our goodbyes because we were going to different colleges. We parted ways with the promise that we would continue to see each other, that we would continue to make our relationship work. And we did for the first few years. We would plan trips to see each other and spend a few days to a week together. It had really felt like we'd cracked the long-distance relationship code in those early years, but the cracks started to spread later on. In my third year of college and a few years into Zach and I's on and off, long-distance relationship, I started to notice that he was acting strange. He would go out of his way to make sure that we only ever met up where I was. If that weren't odd enough, there was also the fact that he would be irritable the entire time he was with me. I didn't say anything about his behavior, and it continued on for a while. It felt like he got more annoyed the more he came to see me, and it was causing a rift between us. Eventually, it got to be too much years later, when he came down for my small graduation party and proceeded to make faces the entire time. It practically ruined my day, and by the end of the night I was tired of it, so I demanded to know what was wrong. A part of me will always wish that I'd never said anything, because the second I acknowledged his behavior, he took that as the go-ahead he needed to break up with me. He told me that what we were doing just wasn't realistic since we were headed in different directions, that we would only keep holding each other back if we stayed together. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I felt devastated and heartbroken. Meanwhile, he had the nerve to look only slightly uncomfortable as he watched me struggle with everything he'd just said. Eventually, when it was clear that I had nothing to say to him, I wasn't going to beg to be with someone who was convinced I'd been holding him back for years, he grabbed his things and left. At first, I'd let myself be delusional enough to believe that not dating wouldn't also mean the end of our friendship, but that was the last time I heard from him. Months later, I was still reeling from losing not only the love of my life, but also my best friend, and that was how I'd ended up at the bar where I would meet my future husband. Now that tedious bit is out of the way, and you all have a bit of backstory on my relationship with Zach, it's time to revisit that phone call. Like I said, it was Zach on the other end of the line. I hadn't heard from him in years, and was more than surprised to hear his voice. It was awkward and strange as we went through the motions of asking after each other. It was so weird being that awkward and stilted with someone who had been your whole world just a few years ago. He brought up the fact that I was getting married and offered half-hearted congratulations. I was just about to ask why exactly he'd called after all these years, when he asked if we could talk in person. I was instantly skeptical, but he went out of his way to convince me that he just wanted to see me again and catch up. I agreed, even though I probably shouldn't have, and we planned to meet at a coffee shop near my apartment. That way I could leave anytime I wanted to. He showed up to the coffee place looking older but still handsome. He looked put together and well taken care of, and a part of me was upset by that. I wanted to be the one doing well between us, the one who succeeded after the breakup. We chatted idly for a bit about nonsense, how work was and how our parents were doing and so on. I couldn't understand why he wasn't saying anything important, why he'd pour salt on an old wound for nothing. I was considering leaving when he suddenly blurted out that he was still in love with me, and that if I still had any love for him at all, I would hold off on getting married. I couldn't believe it. That he'd waited years to contact me again, only to confess his supposed love at a random coffee shop, barely a month before I was marrying someone else. I wasn't sure what to do or what to say, but I did know that where we were was no place for this kind of conversation, and so, against my better judgment, I invited him back to the apartment. The second he stepped inside, I told him that his little act was not funny, and that he was cruel for pulling something like this after years of not speaking. He told me that it wasn't an act, and that after a few years of being apart, He realized what a mistake he'd made. The shame of it had kept him from coming back or contacting me. But when he'd heard I was getting married, he knew he had to do something. The whole thing was like something out of a poorly written movie, and yet I couldn't help the way my heart was pounding as I watched him, my best friend and the first man I'd ever loved. He moved in closer to me and begged. Suddenly, he didn't look as put together as he had before. Then he seemed small and sad, almost pathetic. It reminded me of his 17-year-old self, of the person I'd known years ago. It made me feel nostalgic and hopeful, and a lot of other emotions. Those emotions were what caused me to not think clearly, to throw caution to the wind, and moved closer to him as he continued to please with me. Then after that, when he noticed that I wasn't pushing him away or yelling at him to get out, he leaned forward and kissed me. There are so many things I should have done when it came to this, but pushing him away is at the top of the list. I didn't, though, as you can imagine, and part of me couldn't bring myself to regret it. Kissing him felt so familiar and warm, like coming home, as cliché as that is. It felt like this first time it had happened between us. We had spent so many years apart that the kiss was a bit awkward and fumbling at first. I didn't stop what came next. I had sex with him in an apartment I shared with my fiancé. It didn't happen in the head I shared with Tony at the very least, but it still happened. Like the kiss, it was awkward and a bit strange after so long, but that didn't make it bad. Zach was familiar, and I don't know. There was just something about sleeping with someone you had an actual connection with that just made the act so much better. After all was said and done, though, the reality of what had happened settled in. Before I asked him to leave, I told him that there was nothing he could do or say to convince me to be with him again. Then afterwards, I took a long, very hot shower. It wasn't like I actually believed I could wash away what I'd done or what had happened, but it made me feel better in the moment. I sat down on the bathroom floor after that, and I stared at my wedding ring for a long while. I'd taken it off during sex with Zach, but had put it back on after the shower. For a few heartbroken moments, I tried to convince myself that what happened hadn't exactly been cheating. I decided to see it as a clean cut, emotional closure to a long, tumultuous relationship. Yes, it was an awful thing to do, and I had completely betrayed Tony's trust in me, but in its own weird way, it gave me clarity. Sleeping with him made it clear to me that what we had was over. It felt like a goodbye when it was over with. It felt like I had finally put an end to Zach's chapter in my life, and now I could focus on my new journey with Tony by my side. I spent the next few weeks trying to forget that it had ever happened, and hoping that Tony wouldn't notice that I was acting strange and feeling even stranger. What happened between me and Zach didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like closure, but I wasn't naive enough to think Tony or anyone else would feel the same way, so I pretended like nothing happened. Less than 2 weeks away from the wedding, my mom called me to ask about the songs that she was going to give to the DJ. Most of them she had picked out herself, and others had come from Tony. She asked me if there was any song I wanted to add, or if I wanted to dedicate a song to anyone. I thought about it for a while before telling her the one I wanted, and she laughed when she heard it. It was an old song she would play around the house all the time when I was younger, one that she and Zach's mom had made me and him dance to in the living room right before we left for prom. I didn't tell her that I was dedicating it to Zach as a kind of final goodbye, and she must have just assumed that I had chosen it because of nostalgia. I didn't correct her. The next 2 weeks were hectic enough that I had completely forgotten about the song dedication by the time of the wedding, and the wedding itself was stressful, overwhelming, and beautiful. It left no room in my mind to think about anyone else but Tony, and so I didn't. In that time, though I didn't think about Zach, I couldn't help my immense guilt. Tony became even more loving as the wedding approached. He would buy me gift and tell me about he couldn't wait to marry me. The way he looked at me should have made me swoon with love, and instead it made me sick with guilt. Each kind word and each gift made me feel worse than before, so I tried my hardest to put my guilt to the side. Instead, I focused on how lucky I was that I was going to marry someone so caring, and whole loved me as much and as deeply as Tony did. I let his love for me distract me from what I'd done, so that I could focus on wedding preparations and writing my vows. I knew that Tony was the one for me, and that it was up to me to not let Zach stand in the way of that. And my efforts paid off because the wedding was beautiful. Every part of it. from the decorations to the food to my dress. There were tears in both of our eyes as I walked down the aisle and as we said our vows. For a brief second, I thought about what had happened with Zach, and it felt like a stain, a bad decision that could ruin something so perfect. But my thoughts were immediately thrown out of my head the second Tony slid the ring onto my finger. We were surrounded by our friends and family and people who had supported us in so many different ways. People who were just as happy and emotional to be there as we were. It truly was the most magical day, and in that moment, it felt like there was nothing that could ruin my happiness. I was wrong, though, of course, and my happiness would be ruined shortly after, at the reception while everyone was dancing and drinking. Tony's arms were wrapped around me as we swayed to the music and whispered things to each other, things that I can't remember, but know were all kinds of proclamations of love. But then the DJ played that song, and for a second I was confused before remembering that I had been the one who chose the song as a dedication to Zach, a final goodbye and separation. As I expected, the second I heard the melody, I felt sad and nostalgic as I finally closed such a huge chapter of my life, finally said goodbye to Zach and all that he had meant to me. What I didn't expect, though, and what had me and a few other guests pausing in place, was for Tony to completely stop dancing. He went still in my arms, and when I pulled back to look at him, I saw that he was all but glaring at the DJ as he announced that the song had been a special request from the bride. Tony looked at me like I'd betrayed him then, and I was incredibly confused. For a second, I thought maybe he understood the meaning behind the song, and thus knew about what happened with Zach, but I knew that it couldn't have been true. Short of Zach trying to ruin my life by telling Tony himself, there was no way he could have found out what happened. Without saying a word to me, he pulled away and walked out as the song continued playing. Everyone stopped to stare at us, at him walking away, and me still standing there with my arms up. It took me only a few seconds to come to my senses and chase after him, and it was during said chase that I realized why Tony had walked out. I remembered how one night in the early years of our relationship, I'd told Tony a bit about Zach, and much to my embarrassment at the time, about how we'd been forced to dance to that song in the living room like children. I told him about how the song now meant a lot to the two of us because of that night. I immediately felt like an idiot and regretted my choice to add that song. I knew that Tony couldn't have known everything that had happened with Zach, but he definitely knew that something was wrong. Tony demanded to know what was going on the second he heard me rush up to him, and I struggled with what to say. In the end, I decided to go with the truth and just tell him everything. I tried to explain to him that what happened didn't actually mean anything, and that if anything, it was kind of needed for me to fully let Zach go and be able to completely and wholeheartedly focus on him. Unsurprisingly, he didn't believe me. He thought that I'd slept with Zach because I missed him and still wanted to be with him, and that I'd chosen that song to mock him, Tony, because I knew full well that he would figure out something was wrong. He told me that he was disgusted with me and that he needed space from me. I tried to beg him, to get him to see things from my perspective and understand that I didn't do any of it maliciously, but he wasn't hearing any of it. I watched him walk away from our wedding reception and leave in his car. I stood outside crying for God knows how long, wondering if I should chase after him or give him the space he said he wanted, and wondering what the hell I would tell everyone when I got back inside. Tony didn't come back to the reception that night, and I had to spin some story to everyone about how he didn't feel well and had to head back home. I told them that everything was fine and that they could go back to partying while I worried over whether I'd just ended my marriage before it could even begin. It's been a few days since then, and Tony still hasn't come back to the apartment. I can't ask anyone about where he is, because then they'll know something happened between us. I've tried calling, but there's been no response. The flight for our honeymoon is in 2 days, and I don't know what to do. How can I fix any of this? How can I get him to understand why I did what I did? We've been married for barely a week, and I might have already ruined everything. What do I do?